So I finally got my own Nintendo Switch in May of this year, and soon after that, I remember watching my first ever Nintendo Direct, and I was flabbergasted at the last game announced at the event, which turned out to be Super Mario RPG. Now, Mario is a series of games I adore for their fantastic mechanics that are polished to perfection, but it's not a series of games that I would ever associate with like complex worlds or interesting storytelling. Meanwhile, RPGs, especially jRPGs, which this seems to be, are a genre of games known mostly for their immaculate storytelling, but not necessarily for their focus on gameplay. So this just seemed to be like an incredibly strange combination that might come out either as one of the best games I've ever played or as a complete disaster. And needless to say, I was really excited to see how it turns out, and I set the date of when the game was supposed to come out in my calendar because I was just so excited to play day one. But not long after that, I found out that the game coming out on Switch is actually a remake of a 1996 SNES game called Super Mario RPG: The Legend of the Seven Stars. And I was kinda surprised by that because it's a Mario game that I've never heard of. And okay, sure, I get the excuse of the game releasing 2 years before I was even born, but on the other hand, you know, Resident Evil is one of my favorite games of all time and it came out the same year. I'm really into retro gaming, so it was still shocking to me that there was an entire Mario RPG game that I've never heard of. So after dealing with the shock, I was incredibly excited to try out that game. Especially since, you know, I'm unemployed right now and I don't really have much disposable income to blow on games. And well, here was a chance for me to play a game that is getting remade soon. And, you know, if I enjoy the game, then I'll definitely buy the remake. But if I don't, then well, I just saved $60 or $70 or whatever much it's going to cost. So now the remake is out and I have finished the original. And well, I'm here to deliver you my review of that game. Is it worth playing in 2023? Should you buy the remake? Or should you just skip it altogether? Well, let's find out. Just a quick disclaimer. You cannot really legally play the original right now. It's not available on Nintendo Switch Online for obvious reasons, as Nintendo just remade it and they don't want you to be playing the game as a part of your subscription. And of course, you could track down an original SNES and the original cartridge, unless you live in Europe like me, where the game never even came out in the first place. So the only way to play the SNES original right now is emulation, and thankfully it's 2023 and emulating SNES is super simple. You can just get a $50 console, which you just drop the game onto and it just plays it, or you know, I'll link you a tutorial to how to configure an emulator on your PC down in the description. So if you want to play the game, it's not hard to access it at all. So there's that. And I always like to state my biases before reviewing a game. So here goes. First of all, I'm a gigantic Mario fan. I adore the platformer games. Like, if you check out my review of the original Super Mario Bros. Game, I still consider it to be one of the greatest games ever made, and I play it regularly. And I also play a ton of like new Super Mario Bros. On the DS. I played a ton of Super Mario Bros. 64. I played a ton of Mario games, right? And I adore this character, I adore this series, and I also love RPGs, but I don't necessarily like jRPGs. I played quite a few of them and I always found them underwhelming. Like, sure, even if the game delivered a great story, well, usually I was really underwhelmed by the gameplay. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of jRPGs. But again, this year I've played Sea of Stars, which is a jRPG that's absolutely fantastic, and it has a much better gameplay experience than all the other ones I've ever played. And that game cites as its two main inspirations Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG. So needless to say, I was extremely excited about this game coming into it. So obviously, rose-colored glasses, I really wanted this game to be good. Of course, I had my doubts. I didn't really expect a great story and a great cast of characters from a Mario game. But on the other hand, I had a very high amount of confidence in the fact that this game is going to execute its mechanics perfectly, since, well, first of all, it's a Mario game, and second of all, it inspired probably the best mechanical jRPG I've ever played. So I was like really optimistic about the mechanics of this game. Was I right? Well, you'll find out in a second. When I first booted up the game, I was immediately charmed by it. Mario games are inherently charming. They have this like fun, warm, welcoming vibe to them, and this game is no exception. In the intro, you see Princess Peach picking up some flowers, then she's kidnapped by Bowser, and then you take control of Mario, and the game actually starts where most Mario games would end, with Mario storming Bowser's castle to save the princess. But the thing is, after a quick turn-based battle with Bowser, a giant sword crashes into his castle, knocking all three characters out of it, and Mario is confused. He doesn't know what happened. Usually he would just save the princess and return her to the Mushroom Kingdom, but now the princess is missing, so is Bowser, and he magically lands in his house because this is Mario, and the physics of the Mario universe are interesting. After we exit Mario's house, we meet up with Toad, and Toad immediately starts showering you with a fountain of tutorials. Now, I get it. This game was made in collaboration by Nintendo and Square, and of course, it was intended to get a younger audience acclimated to RPGs so that they would buy more Square RPGs on the SNES, which would obviously benefit both companies. I get it, it's a game meant for kids, so that's why you get a ton of tutorials. But even still, I found it absolutely frustrating how many tutorial messages you have to get through and how much it slows the pace of the beginning of the game to a crawl. But aside from that, still, when I arrived at the Mushroom Kingdom with Toad, I was impressed again with the dialogue of this game. It's just so funny, man. It's actually well written, which surprised me a lot. I didn't expect good writing from a Mario game, but here we are. You can talk to all of the civilians in the Mushroom Kingdom, which is pretty cool. But when you go and talk to the Chancellor, well, Mario can't really speak. So he has to mime the whole situation to the Chancellor, and he like turns into Bowser, then he turns into Peach, then he turns back into himself, but he jumps into the air and falls down to the ground to mimic the sword. And it's just absolutely hilarious. But somehow everyone around him understands precisely what Mario means with all his miming, which is just, you know, hilarious again. And once you exit the castle, you meet your first companion, Mallow, who's a cloud who thinks he's a frog. Yeah, don't expect the tone of this game to be very serious. Do you know what? I enjoy comedy sometimes, and I found this like lighthearted approach to be, once again, pretty charming. So when we meet Mallow, he's crying his eyes out and causing rain over the entire kingdom because he's a cloud. And yeah, apparently his money was stolen by a dinosaur named Croco. So we chase after Croco together to retrieve Mallow's money. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the game's graphics, because as you've probably noticed, they are very stylized, and I think this is going to be a love it or hate it thing. For the positive, it is incredibly colorful. The game definitely has this welcoming, fun Mario vibe, and I love that. And the clarity here is really good. But when I'm talking about the love it or hate it spectrum, I definitely fall closer to the latter side, because, man, this game uses those same pre-rendered 3D graphics as something like Donkey Kong Country would, and I have the same take as I do on that game. I just think that those kinds of pre-rendered graphics have aged horribly compared to pixel art games from the same era, like, I don't know, Chrono Trigger or Super Mario World. I think those two games look way better than Super Mario RPG now. And the worst part about the pre-rendered graphics is it seems like Nintendo and Square really wanted to show off like the peak of the SNES's capabilities. So they went for an isometric perspective that's rotated 45 degrees away from the player. And the goal here was to provide a perception of depth that would make this game seem almost like as if it were 3D. And they have succeeded in that. The game really does play and look as if it were a 3D game, and back then 3D gaming was something entirely new, so I can only assume how impressive it was to see something like this. But unfortunately, this also comes at a huge cost to the gameplay. Super Mario RPG actually tries to fix one of my biggest problems with jRPGs, which is how boring exploration and traversal is in those games. And it adds some platforming elements to the overworld, which is fantastic. I love that. I love the attempt to make the exploration more interesting. And you see all of the enemies running around the place, and a battle only starts when you touch one of those enemies. This is really cool. This is legitimate innovation in the JRPG genre, but it's ruined by that camera perspective, because the controls here are really clunky and unresponsive, and it really is hard to judge where Mario will land after a jump. And this just makes the platforming elements, especially later on in the game, incredibly frustrating. At the start, it didn't really bother me, but as the game started going on and on, I definitely wished the game just used a more pixel art kind of graphics and a normal camera. And since we're talking about the gameplay, let's talk for a bit about the combat. And the combat here is turn-based, as in most Square JRPGs, but it has some improvements. So on each turn, your character can choose between one of 4 actions. They can attack the enemy, they can use an item, they can use a spell, or they can defend from an enemy's attack. So when it comes to attacks, Super Mario RPG actually introduces a fantastic mechanic that was done to perfection in Sea of Stars this year, which is an action press. So what happens is when you're about to land an attack on an enemy, you can press the attack button again, and if you time it correctly, you will deal increased damage to the enemy. This is a simple action element added to turn-based combat, which could make it a ton more engaging. When it comes to using items, you know, you can just heal yourself, you can revive a downed ally, you can heal status effects, everything that items would normally do. When it comes to spells, Mario only has 2 at the start of the game. He can jump on an enemy, dealing some physical damage, or he can use the Fire Flower. And both of those are single target spells, but Mallow has some more interesting ones. First of all, he has Thunderstorm, which is an AoE ability, which hits every enemy on the field, which is incredibly useful. And he also has Healing Rain, which, as the name suggests, is a heal. And Defense, which is the last button, essentially allows you to skip a turn in exchange for a bonus to your defensive stats on the enemy's turn. In general, I like some of the ideas that they have here, and some spells, like for example Thunderstorm, also have action press elements just like the basic attacks, which is fantastic. But one criticism I have here is, especially compared to Sea of Stars, which perfected this system, the feedback you get when you do an action press correctly is non-existent pretty much. I wish there was some kind of a sound cue or a different animation that shows you that you've executed your action press correctly, Now, depending on the weapon your character uses, some of them have an obvious animation feedback, like when you use punching gloves, for example, you will just land a second punch. But when you use something like a finger gun later in the game, this just doesn't have any kind of animation cue when you do time your action press correctly, which did bother me a little bit. So anyway, after we catch up with and eventually defeat Croco, we make our way back to the Mushroom Kingdom, and we find it under attack by a bunch of monsters who are bouncing around on springs for whatever reason. And as we battle our way back into the castle, we find the Chancellor held hostage by a giant sword on a spring named Mac. And after we defeat Mac, we claim our first Power Star. And at this point, nobody knows what the hell is going on. Who are those monsters? Where did they come from? What does the star do? Nobody has any answers. So Mallow tells us we ought to seek out his father, the philosopher Frogfucius, who will probably know what is going on. After doing some shopping, we head out from the Mushroom Kingdom through rat and ghost infested sewers and eventually end up in Tadpole Pond, where we do meet Frogfucius, who explains that he thinks those monsters, Mac as well as the gigantic sword who pierced Bowser's castle, are servants of someone named Smithy. And to defeat Smithy, we will need to collect all 7 of those Power Stars. And he gives us a lead to go to the nearby Rose Town, because apparently that's where we can look for our second star, but not before revealing to Mallow that, to everyone's surprise, he's actually adopted. Nobody expected that plot twist. So together with Mallow, we decide to head out on the mission to collect all 7 stars and, as an additional side quest, find the princess and hopefully Mallow's parents. As we make our way to Rose Town, we find it under a constant barrage of paralyzing arrows who immobilize anyone they hit. And after a brief conversation with the owner of the local inn, we decide to head into the forest, where we encounter a living puppet named Gino, who's after Boyer, the living bow responsible for the barrage of arrows. After we defeat Boyer and claim our second star, Gino reveals to us that he's actually from the Star Realm, and those stars are pieces of the Star Road, which used to grant people's wishes, but was recently destroyed by Smithy. And apparently, nobody's wishes will ever come true again unless we find all the stars and repair the Star Road. So after Mallow and Mario agree to help him, Gino joins our party. And I got to say, the story here, while simple, is definitely interesting enough to keep my attention. The writing is surprisingly good and the party members are exceptionally endearing and I love listening to them talk. But I'll cover that topic a little bit more once we unlock all 5 of the party members later down the road. And for the first 3 to 4 hours of this game, I was having a ton of fun. But as we team up with Gino and head to the mountain town of Mollville, some cracks were beginning to show. First of all, the battle theme gets repetitive real quick. And don't get me wrong, this is not a dig at the music in this game, which is for the most part fantastic. And the battle theme itself is pretty great too, but the problem is it is a very short loop and you'll be hearing it hundreds of times while playing this game, and it's nearly always the same battle theme for every encounter. So after some time I was legitimately hearing this music in my sleep. It was annoying, but what's even more annoying were the needless minigames. It really does seem like half of the time spent playing this game, especially in the first half, are pointless minigames. And there is so many of them. There's the river course after you escape the sewers, where your task is to get as many coins as possible. There is the music composing a tadpole pond. There is the whack-a-mole in the pipe vault. There is the Yoshi racing on Yoaster Island. And at this point, I was already so over those minigames. But as we finally get to Moleville and we have to rescue some kids from the mine, we head in there. We meet up with Croco, which is a pretty cool encounter. And after we defeat Croco, as well as Punchinello, another one of Smithy's servants, we get rewarded with our 3rd star and another minigame, the minecart racing, which was particularly frustrating because it was just so slow and clunky and annoying and absolutely mandatory to finish. And soon after, there is another minigame where we have to hide behind curtains as more and more enemies are searching for us. And the worst part is that several of those minigames, like the whack-a-mole or the one where you hide behind the curtains or the river course, are absolutely ruined by the isometric camera perspective and the horrible controls. And some of them, like the hiding one, also restart you at the very beginning of the minigame if you make as much as a single mistake, which can often not even be your fault. It can just be the camera playing a fucking trick on you, which is so goddamn frustrating. And this was so annoying to me because those minigames aren't fun and you're forced to do them. I'm like, just let me skip the shit, bro. Let me get to the real game here. But anyway, we find out that Peach is held captive by some guy named Booster, and we head into his tower, and along the way we meet Bowser, who decides to join our party. See, he was abandoned by his troops and he really wants his castle back, so he will stoop as low as to let Mario join his Koopa troop. And I love Bowser here, but once again, we'll talk about the companions later. And as we ascend Booster's tower, I feel like this area is really the microcosm of everything that's great about this game and everything that's absolutely dogshit about this game. First of all, there is some pretty cool combat encounters here, and there is a really fun puzzle where you have to press the portraits of Booster's ancestors in the correct order, and as a reward we get a stronger weapon from Bowser. I love that. There is also an Easter egg where if you go behind a curtain you will walk out as 8-bit Mario, which was pretty fun. But there's also some annoying platforming elements here, and you can actually fall all the way down the tower thanks to those dogshit controls that I mentioned later. And if you do, there is so many enemies as you head up that you can't really dodge them all, and you'll be forced to engage in more and more of repetitive combat encounters. And on the flip side, there is some pretty good writing here about Booster, who's a complete idiot who's trying to force Peach to marry him, and he absolutely believes that Peach wants to marry him because he has no idea that people can talk and have their own free will. But after we defeat the tower's boss and chase Booster to get Peach back, there's yet another frustrating minigame that's also completely ruined by the isometric camera and imprecise controls. I genuinely feel like this area showcases what's great about this game and what's bad about this game perfectly. Anyway, we crash the wedding, we defeat the giant cake and the angry patissier, we rescue Peach from Booster, then we return her to the Mushroom Kingdom, and all is well. Well, until Peach decides to sneak out of the castle and join our party in search of the 4th star, becoming our 5th and final party member. And I feel like this is a great place to talk about the party members. And in general, I fucking love them. I find that they have so much personality and they all play so different in combat that they are Every single one of them is just a fantastic addition to the game. I absolutely adore the party. Mario, he's Mario, right? Everyone knows him, both in the real world and in his world. He's a mute, he never talks, he has to mime about everything, and again, everyone surprisingly understands him. And the best part is, his jumping is his signature move even in universe. So once I was asked to provide ID before I could go shopping, and Mario just jumped, and the shopkeeper goes like, "Yep, that's Mario, alright, okay, what can I get you?" Which was hilarious. And in general, the dialogue in this game is pretty great. Then we have Mallow, who's my absolute favorite party member. He's a clumsy little cloud, but he's very determined to find his lost parents. We have Gino, who's the fun favorite in general. He's mysterious and very, very driven to achieve his goal of restoring the Star Road. There is Bowser, who's, you know, evil and a little bit dumb, but he's got a big heart and he really cares about his troops. Even after they abandon him, he still cares about them. So he's not a bad guy deep down, and I find him a really fantastic addition to the party. There are many moments where you could see like his inner monologue, and he's like, "Well, I can't let it seem like I need Mario to finish my task," and then he comes up with some like ridiculous bullshit to justify joining Mario. It's just fantastic. And then there's Peach, who's a very strong female character in here, because yeah, of course, she has to get rescued, and she is the princess and she just wants everyone to get along really well. But on the other hand, she's not afraid of breaking the rules when it really matters. So I find all of the characters here to have their own distinct personality and really good character writing, which is actually hilarious because I expected so much of characters in Sea of Stars, where they turned out to be paper thin, even though the game has some fantastic world building. But here, in Mario's nonsensical world, somehow we have characters with pretty insane writing who are all very likable and distinct from one another. And they also play completely different in combat. So Mario, he has the best physical damage in the game and can also tank quite a bit, but he struggles against crowds as he has no good AoE spells. Mallow, on the other hand, has a fantastic AoE spell, and a few of them too, and his spells also tend to exploit enemies' elemental weaknesses. He can also heal, but as a downside, he is pretty squishy and easy to kill. Gino starts off pretty weak in the early game, but he scales monstrously as the game goes on, thanks to his attack boost, which can empower every other ally's attacks as well as his own, and his fantastic but very expensive AoE spells, which you'll only use very late in the game. Bowser has great physical attack and can inflict status effects like fear and sleep on enemies, but and he's also the tankiest member, but he has no real magic damage in his kit. And Peach, she is the group's healer. She has fantastic heals, both single target and AoE. She can also cure status effects, she can revive people, she also has some status effects against the enemies, but as a downside, she has very weak physical attacks, and she's even easier to kill than Mallow. So I find the balance of the characters here absolutely lovely. Even though for most of the game I was running with a party of Mario, Mallow and Bowser, by the end I switched to Mario, Gino and Peach. So every single character got some playtime, which is lovely. They are all balanced and they all have their uses. I love that. And with all 5 members together, we head to a port town where the inhabitants are acting hella sus. You know that something is wrong with them, but the town elder tells you that the 5th star is in possession of a guy named Johnny who inhabits a sunken ship. And as we head out to explore that ship, this was the part of the game where all of my frustrations were starting to boil over. Actually, let me read the notes I was writing live as I was playing the game. And I quote, This game honestly sucks. Combat is so fucking bad. I am 8 hours into the game and I stopped having fun like 4 hours ago. Combat is either piss easy, wiping all regular enemies with a single 2 FP spell from Malo, or it's fucking monstrously difficult. And while fighting Yaridovich, I had to use 8 revives and still wiped. Fuck this game, honestly. And to explain why I felt that way, let me elaborate. First of all, going back to the graphic design, which is impressive for the time but really non-functional, there are many places where you can enter that don't seem like places you can enter. This was already a problem as early as the sewers, where I had to spend like 30 minutes just looking for a way forward because I couldn't realize that I could enter one place which just looked like yet another dead end. But in the ship it becomes unfucking bearable because I run into this puzzle where I have to enter a password, and I found no clues whatsoever as to what the password could be, and I was searching throughout the entire ship and couldn't find anything, couldn't figure out any way to progress. I actually had to look up a guide to realize that the fucking windows that you find in the ship are actually doors you can go through, which I did not realize because it's not visually clear, and only after that I was allowed to go inside, only to find some fucking annoying puzzles that are absolutely ruined by the game's camera. Many of them require some very precise movement, which is fucking impossible thanks to those garbage controls. And another annoying part was the combat. At this point, I really thought I was over leveled because I was just breezing through the ship. Every single combat encounter went the same. I hit skip turn as Mario, I hit skip turn as Bowser, then I used a single 2 FP AoE spell, Thunderstorm, as Malo, wiped all the enemies and proceeded further. Rinse and repeat. And there was so many of those combat encounters and all of them felt the same. And I was like, did I grind too much? Did I get into too many fights? Why is this game so goddamn easy? It was annoyingly easy because there was no challenge. The only challenge was not getting bored while the combat animations were playing. And eventually I managed to defeat Johnny rather easily, claim the 5th star, and as I headed back into the town, turns out that of course the town's inhabitants were just Smithy's minions pretending to be the town's inhabitants, and Smithy's servant, Yaridovich, threatened us that they will hurt the actual inhabitants of the town unless we give the star back. And at this point I actually had the choice to either give the star back or not, and if every time I refused they would go and tickle the inhabitants of the city. But even though I kept doing it, eventually it just started looping the animations and I had to give the star back. And eventually I chased after Yaridovich, and suddenly the difficulty just spiked way up because that guy absolutely wiped the fucking floor with me. Every 3 turns he was using an AoE spell that would wipe out like 70 to 80% of each of my party members' HP. I fought a grueling 20-minute fight against him. I used up all of my healing items, all of my revives, all of my everything, and I still wiped. And I was like, what the hell? I thought I was over leveled the entire time, and suddenly I'm just way under leveled. Like nothing I could do in this battle could have any impact. I was just not doing enough damage to the guy and he was just one-shotting me. The difficulty spike here was so frustrating that I genuinely thought of just fucking quitting the game at this point. But instead of quitting, since I was clearly under-leveled, I decided to grind instead and get some more levels. But the problem here is that the animations in this game are so bloody slow and unskippable. So combat encounters that should last like 2 seconds with me just pressing the AoE spell as Mallow and killing all the enemies would last like 30 seconds up to a minute, depending on how many times enemies managed to attack before I got to use the fucking AoE spell. It was so frustrating that I started using the emulator's fast forward feature just to make this more bearable. And newsflash to all jRPG stands, because I hear this argument a lot, oh, just use fast forward. Spoiler fucking alert, if the game's combat is so slow and boring that you have to speed it up to bear with it, it's not fucking good game design! In my Sea of Stars video, I mentioned that that game does something that most JRPGs simply can't. For a second feels either overwhelming and confusing, or easy and boring. I'm not usually a fan of turn-based combat systems because they seem to always sway to either of the extremes at some point, but Sea of Stars does a perfect job of never veering too far from the Goldilocks zone in the middle. And sadly, Mario RPG lives at either of the extreme like 95% of the time. You can be at the same time over-leveled for normal fights, making them trivially easy and just piss boring, and at the same time you can be so underleveled for bosses that they're literally impossible to beat. So the only solution I found was to just grind out as many levels as possible in order to just make the entire game a cakewalk, which actually meant that, yeah, like the normal combat encounters were literally just pointless interruptions, but thankfully now boss fights were an appropriate challenge instead of an overwhelming one. This is not good game balance. At some point, to make my grind more efficient, I actually decided to grind the minigames, which I hated, to get enough frog coins to get an item that doubles the XP that a select character will earn, so that I can grind levels faster, so that I can engage with the combat less. That's not good game design! But don't get me wrong, the progression here in general is very good. As you level up, you not only get the mandatory in JRPGs increase to every stat, you also get to choose some select stats that you will put more points into, which I found pretty cool because you are allowed to customize your build a little bit, and you'll find a lot of weapons in the world, and you can either buy those weapons as well as armor, or if you explore, you might find some even more powerful weapons, like the powerful weapon for Bowser that was the reward for solving the puzzle in Booster's Tower, which is just fantastic. And the weapons here not only improve your damage, they also all feel a little bit different. As Mario, you can use boxing gloves, you can use a hammer, you can use a Koopa shell, and all of them feel different. I love that. I love that system. So don't get me wrong, the progression here is not the problem. The problem I have here is the pacing and difficulty scaling, which is simply all over the fucking place. And again, this is a very common complaint for JRPGs in general, but I really hope that since this game inspired Sea of Stars, which had absolutely no problems with it, that maybe Mario wouldn't have them either, but sadly it does, and it's one of the worst at it that I've seen in my entire life. And another thing that it's probably one of the worst things that I've experienced in my entire time of playing video games, in like over 20 years by now, is the platforming here. The isometric camera simply does not work. There are some mighty annoying fragments. There is a spot where you have to climb a very tall wall by jumping on Koopa shells. There is the volcano section later in the game, which is absolutely infuriating. But the absolute fucking worst that I've experienced is the sequence where you have to climb the beanstalk. And the problem here really is the camera, because distances away from the player seem shorter than distances towards the player, and this makes calculating how far your character will jump simply impossible. Couple that with those annoying controls where the game is on a square grid, but the grid is rotated 45 degrees, so you have to use diagonals on the D-pad to proceed along the grid. It's just mind-bogglingly frustrating and just fucking plain bad. This is definitely the worst platforming that Mario has ever been a part of. And yes, I'm counting the terrible PC 88 ports. This legitimately is the worst platforming in a Mario game ever. It's simply horrible. And don't you fucking hit me with the get good here. No, I grit my fucking teeth on Mario games. I beat the Lost Levels, which is the hardest fucking Mario game. And even 10 hours into Mario RPG, I still had fucking problems with the platforming. You might be like, just get good, just get good. It's not a fucking case that you can just get good. The game is simply fucking bad. Thankfully, while the 8 to 10 hour mark was incredibly frustrating, I did manage to power through it, and the game does pick back up in quality after you reach the Cloud Kingdom. When you go there, it turns out the king and queen are apparently gravely ill, and the castle has been taken over by a woman named Valentina, who apparently found the missing Prince Mallow, who looks suspiciously like a gigantic dodo bird, and she's going to marry him in order to take over the kingdom. Oh yeah, turns out Mallow is the missing prince. And one of the sculptors actually recognizes Mallow as looking incredibly similar to his father, and he helps us get into the castle disguised as a statue. So after battling through some of Valentina's goons, we finally managed to defeat her, we free Mallow's parents, we dive into a volcano to find the 6th star, and then we can finally head to Bowser's castle for the final confrontation with Smithy. But before that, I decided to do some side questing. So I was actually skipping many side quests in the latter half of the game because I was just kinda frustrated with the game and wanted it to be over with as soon as possible. But by the end, I started having fun again, so I decided to do a couple of them. And my favorite one was getting the lazy shells. And this side quest was kinda crazy. First of all, it involved securing the seeds of a beanstalk plant after defeating a monstrous plant earlier in the game. Then I needed to find this shy guy who was out of bounds in the Cloud Kingdom and get the fertilizer from him. Then I needed to deliver both to a gardener way back in Rose Town, who had some fantastic, hilarious banter. I loved talking to him. And after that, he grew a giant beanstalk, which I could climb to find the 2 lazy shells. And the lazy shells are goddamn awesome. The first one is the best weapon Mario can get in the game. It does insane damage. The second lazy shell is the most powerful armor in the game, but it does have the downside of severely reducing the damage of whoever wears it. And as many others have also figured out, the best use case for the lazy shell is to stick it onto Peach, as she's not really meant to be a damage dealer at all. So by equipping the lazy shell on her, not only do you make her virtually invulnerable, she's incredibly tanky wearing it, she doesn't really lose on much utility because you don't really care that much about how much damage she deals, and she becomes this tank healer hybrid. Equipping the lazy shell just makes Peach by far the most overpowered companion in the game, which is pretty cool, and I enjoyed running through the late game combat using her and Gino and Mario. It was just a fantastic ragtag squad. And finally, with the lazy shells in tow and all 5 of the party members sufficiently leveled up, I decided to head back to Bowser's castle, where it all started, for the final confrontation with Smithy. And the Bowser's castle level is genuinely fantastic. Not only do you get the nostalgia of coming back to the first area in the game, but also there is some pretty decent combat there, and there is this one part where you have 6 corridors, and 2 of them contain puzzles which are fantastic. They are incredibly fun to solve, and I had so much damn enjoyment of solving them. Two more corridors contain combat rounds, which are grueling tests of enemy after enemy after enemy after enemy, and those were incredibly fun to go through also. And the other two contain platforming challenges. But thankfully, the developers seem to realize that one part of this gameplay is not as good as the other ones, and decided to only require you to beat 4 of the corridors to proceed further, so I didn't have to engage with the shitty platforming. Amazing! After solving 4 of the corridors, you get confronted with Magikoopa, one of Bowser's servants who's being mind controlled by Smithy. And after defeating him in a really cool encounter, you free him from the mind control, and you get to witness a really nice scene between him and Bowser. And after that, he provides you with unlimited resources, both when it comes to gold and when it comes to HP and mana, which is pretty damn cool. And you also get to meet Kroko again, but this time as an ally. He becomes a merchant that you can buy some of the best armor in the game from, which was also a pretty fun touch. And after meeting those guys, you head to the top of Bowser's castle for an epic final showdown against Exo, the giant sword who pierced the castle, which you can actually one-shot using one of Gino's spells due to a bug, which of course I abused. And after defeating Exo, you get transported to the actual final area of the game. And the factory showcases both some of the worst game design in this game, as well as some of the best. It's a really low floor but high ceiling area. So at first when you get there, you have a lot of platforming to do, and it's some of the most frustrating in the game. I was ready to rage quit the game again. I was getting incredibly frustrated by the dogshit platforming in that area. But after you get through it, not only do you get a really cool power trip, because you witness some of the earlier bosses like Boyer and Yaridovich returning as just regular run-of-the-mill enemies, which you have no problem defeating now. After that, you get a boss rush, and this is some of the most fun I had in the game, because each time you defeat a boss, you get all of your resources restored back to full. So what happened was, I got like 8 boss fights in a row, and after every single one, my resources were restored back to full. So finally, for the first time in the entire game, I didn't feel punished for actually using some of the best spells that I had. So I was able to use Gino's incredible AoE spells that normally just costs too many flower points to ever consider using. And this was some fantastic fucking combat. I adored this part of the game. And after you finish it, you get to the final confrontation with Smithy, which is epic. It is an incredibly long fight with 2 phases, which was just simply incredible. But after like 15 minutes, I started wondering, am I doing something wrong? Because I keep fighting him and I keep dealing damage. Am I missing something? Am I missing some gimmick? And turns out no, I was just supposed to keep fighting him, and as I did, I eventually defeated him after about 20 minutes. And once again, I did have fun fighting him, but you know, the entire thing of me questioning whether there's something I'm missing could be solved by one simple thing, which I already mentioned in my Sea of Stars review, but I will mention it in every single jRPG review until they start fucking implementing it. Just give the boss a fucking HP bar, you bastards! It's the simplest solution, and it makes the game so much better. It just adds some accessibility. It doesn't diminish the combat, it only makes the game more exciting. Okay, rant over. And I promise this is not the last time I rant about HP bars in JRPGs, because they need to be implemented as a basic feature. Moving on. After finally defeating Smithy, you get an ending that's very sweet and cute. The Star Road gets repaired, Gino goes back to his people, and you get to witness some cutscenes of some people's wishes coming through. Booster finally gets married to Valentina this time, who gets to be the queen of his tower. Mallow gets reunited with his parents. and so on and so on. It's a very sweet ending and a nice way to cap off the adventure. But now it's time to cap off the review, isn't it? I struggle when rating Super Mario RPG, because at its best, it's a fantastic game with some incredible storytelling and just amazing, likable characters. And if I were rating just this part, the best feelings I get when playing the game, I would give it like an 8.5 because it's a really good game in this regard. But if I was rating the actual gameplay, well, it does get fun at some points, but for the most part, it is just incredibly grueling and frustrating and repetitive. And in that regard, I can't really give this game more than a 5 out of 10 due to the frustration that it caused me. So, what's the final rating? And should you even bother playing it? Well, my final rating for this game is a 6 out of 10, which is pretty much how I feel about the game. 6 is more than halfway through the scale, so it's above average. It is on the good side, but it's not great by any means. And as for whether you should play it, it's hard, because I genuinely did enjoy a lot of my time with this game, but I genuinely did hate a lot of it too. So I would say, if you're a huge Mario fan, or if you are a huge JRPG fan who doesn't mind the grind and boredom, then yes, Super Mario RPG is worth a playthrough. But I would seriously consider the remake on the Switch, on sale preferably, because apparently it does a lot to improve the quality of the game by adding some feedback to the action presses, which was one of my smaller but still important complaints, and apparently it speeds up the battle animations and adds some AoE to normal attacks, which is a pretty cool way to reduce the tedium of grinding levels. So in that regard, yeah, definitely go for the Switch remake instead of the SNES version, unless money is an issue. And in this case, the SNES version is still a good game that you might get enjoyment out of playing, but at the end of the day, it is one of those classics that you can safely skip, as sad as it is for me to say.